Hi, my name's Justin Shelf and I'm the engineering lead at PatchMyPC. We develop a third-party patch management solution that integrates into Microsoft SCCM. Prior to my current role, I was also a premier field engineer at Microsoft supporting SCCM. In this video, it's going to be a follow-up video of our video about the introduction to OSD, covering some of the basics around images, drivers, boot images, and task sequences. So if you haven't watched that and you're not familiar with OSD, you're going to want to start with that video first. In this video, we're going to be showing you how you can integrate Microsoft Deployment Toolkit into Config Manager and use the UDI piece of that, or the user-driven installation. I would often use this when I was a PFE at Microsoft for customers who needed to make their deployments more dynamic. So for example, if they wanted to give their IT technicians the ability to do things like joining custom OUs, selecting different groupings of applications. There's a lot of different wizard panes that we can add to our customizer to make the task sequence more flexible. MDT is not the only way. There's also some community tools out there. I know Jason Sandys has one called UI++. You could even use something as basic as like a VB script that inputs a message box, or a HTA script that would display different options for the user to select. At the end of the day, what we're doing is we're basically assigning different variables that are going to play out within our task sequence based on what the user selects. So UDI is probably one of the easier options because you do most of it through a Wizard designer tool, and we'll go through all that process within this video. So we'll go ahead and get started. What I've got here is just a 1803 site, or I'm sorry, 1802 SCCM site, but I have pre-downloaded MDT. So I've downloaded the latest version of their MSI to install on my SCCM server, or wherever you're running the SCCM console, that would be where you'd want to install this MSI. I'll also include a link to that as well. So it's all pretty basic, just an MSI. We'll go through all the default options here and then install that. All right, that's done. We'll finish that. The next thing that we need to run is if we go out and search for MDT, Microsoft Deployment Toolkit, there's going to be this thing here called the Configure Config Manager Integration. So we're going to run that as administrator, and we're going to choose the option here to install the extensions for Config Manager. So it should read all your site information if you have the console, and then we'll just leave that and then do finish. We'll make sure that it completed successfully and then finish here. Now, in order for this to take effect, what we need to do is reopen our Config Manager console, and then there's going to be a new option here to create a MDT task sequence. So if we come back into our operating systems, task sequences, we see this option here in the top, create MDT task sequence. So we'll go ahead and just get that going and go right through this process. We want to make sure for the template, we keep the default option of a client task sequence. For the task sequence name, I'm just going to call this deploy Windows client. I'm going to keep it pretty generic because when we go through this, I'm going to do things like giving the user the ability to install multiple operating systems. So for example, we'll go through and add Windows 7 and Windows 10. So it can be pretty dynamic in a single task sequence. Now for this option, we're going to join a domain. We're going to choose to join contoso.local. That's just the domain that we're using here in the lab. For the domain join account, we have an account called SCCM_DJ. Go ahead and enter the password for that. And OK. I'll just fill in this with Contoso IT for just the generic information here for the Windows settings. If you had a product key, you could enter that here. One setting I do want to enable is I want to define the local administrator account just in case the task sequence fails to join the domain or something during our testing. We could have the ability to log in with the local administrator account. We're not going to use it to capture an image, so we're going to keep that checked here that will never be used to capture an image. For the boot image, we're going to be deploying 64-bit of Windows 7 and Windows 10. So we'll just choose the default boot image that I have here for 64-bit. Now, this is something that we're going to have to create here. So we need to create a MDT Toolkit package. So what I'm going to do, I just have a UNC path where I keep my different package source files, and I've created a folder under OSD called MDT. So what we're going to do, we're just going to create a new folder here called MDT Toolkit package. And this can really be whatever you want. I'll just keep it Toolkit package. So it just kind of matches with what we're making here. But you certainly could have multiple different packages here if you needed to do different task sequences. So this is just going to copy the different script files that we need for our MDT package, and it's going to copy it to that folder. So I'll just give some information here. This is my MDT Toolkit package used for UDI deployments. The image, so we'll go ahead and just choose a default image here. So I'll choose that enterprise image that we created in the previous video. And we're going to go around and we're going to customize this a little bit more. But for now, we're just make this task sequence created with that default image. Now this option is important. We want to do the user-driven installation. So we're going to give it the front end that the user is going to go through to do customization. So you want to make sure you choose that option. Otherwise, it would do a zero touch where it just goes through the task sequence and you wouldn't get prompted for any customizations. For the config manager client package, we're just going to choose the default client package that should be created with SCCM. So that's where it's going to install the SCCM client from. For the USMT package, there should also be a USMT package that's just built in. So I'll choose that package here. We'll do OK on that. And then next here. Now for the settings package, what we're going to do is we're going to create another folder here, and we're just going to call it MDT settings package. So this is where the unattend.xml and the custom settings are going to go for MDT. So we'll just do an MDT settings package, copy that path, and we're going to create a new package, and it's going to copy the files there. I'll just call this the same thing here, MDT settings package with 1.0 for the version. No sysprep, that's not needed, and then next here. So if we actually look in these folders now, we can see our toolkit package just getting all the different scripts and binaries that are going to actually run that allows us to customize this deployment. So these are pretty much just everything that's going to be running in the back end that the task sequence engine is going to be calling. In that settings package, we can see we have our custom settings.ini. This is what the MDT package uses. Just some default options. We don't have to customize that for this video. And then it's just going to create an unattend file that's going to be used for your actual image deployment on the back end. So that all looks fine. Looks like we created that okay. And then we're going to do finish. All right, so looking at this task sequence, if we edit it, it can be a bit intimidating because it's going to be quite a bit larger than what you would do if you just created a native task sequence through Config Manager. But I just want to kind of quickly go over this, and most of the steps in the task sequence here are actually never going to run. Most of these are going to be condition-based. So for example, let's say that the state capture step. So this would only be if we look at this condition here, if you're not in WinPE. So the state capture would only happen, for example, if you were deploying this to an existing OS and you wanted to do a USMT capture for like a re-image scenario. So even though this is quite a long task sequence, most of these are going to be condition-based, and most of them actually won't even run. So they're going to be condition-based on, for example, what the UDI Wizard we create. Based on the options the user selects, we'll kind of determine which one of these steps run here. So just want to cover that real quickly before we actually start editing this. So the first thing that we're going to do is go over to our toolkit package, and in the scripts folder, we're going to just go ahead and copy that path. And then within MDT, it's going to install something called the UDI Wizard Designer. So if we open up that tool, and then we click open and browse out to the package that we had in that scripts folder, there's going to be a file in here that we want to edit called the UDI wizard_config.xml. So this is the actual XML that controls what wizards are displayed to the end users when they're deploying an image. And this is where we can do our customization. So there's a few different groups here. There's a new computer group, and that's going to be what we're using primarily in this video. So this would be if you're booting up a machine using Pixie or USB image, and it's going directly to WinPE to image the device. This would be considered a new computer scenario. The other scenario that you might do in some scenarios would be the replace scenario or the refresh. That would be if you deployed to an existing device that's already running Config Manager and it's in the full OS and you wanted to re-image it. So if you wanted to have a different set of wizard panes that you show there, we could configure these different grouping options for that scenario. But what we're going to be working with today is this new computer scenario. So within the designer, we have the different pages that we can customize. One thing to note here that this preview option is broken within the UDI designer, but on the back end, we do have the ability to call this preview directly using a command line. So if we open a command prompt, I'm going to paste in what we need to run. I'm going to just copy that path for the XML file. So UDI Wizard _config.xml in my UNC path. And what we're going to do is change that XML path. We're going to double quote it, paste it, and then end the double quote. So what we're doing here is we're running under the installation directory for MDT. There's a templates folder, distribution tools, x64, and then there's going to be this OSD setup wizard.exe. Within that, we're going to run a /preview, and then a /XML:, and then the path to your actual XML file within the package. So if we wanted to just see what that default wizard would look like if we didn't customize it, we can run this preview installer. We can see in the bottom here, it's in the preview mode. So the first pane that we have is the welcome pane. So just some basic information. We can change this text if we want. Then we have BitLocker. We can see that it's enabled by default. It's set to use a TPM and PIN by default. So all these can be customized, but this preview is just showing you what that default XML is set to do. So it's just got a generic Windows 7 image is the name of it. So we're definitely going to change that. Optionally, if you want to have it format or clean the drive, we could have that pre-selected as well. But we'll go through all this in the wizard. USMT backup, that's this page here. The deployment readiness, that will check things like whether the laptop has power, network connection, a few just things that we might want to verify before we start imaging a device. This is where we could enter the computer name, give it a domain, and then a domain join account. Local admin password, if you wanted to allow the user who's deploying this to create a custom local password. Usually we just disable all that. I can't see a good reason to set that at the user level. If you wanted to set user device affinity, we could do that in this page. Different language options, installing different packages or applications, and then the summary page here. So that's kind of what the generic one would look like if you were to just keep everything default. In my case, I'm going to go ahead and click on that BitLocker page. And under the page here, this will just show a little screenshot of what we're doing. Under the BitLocker mode, since I'm going to be generally deploying this to VMs, I'm going to check that box that says, do not initially check it. I'm also going to have it just to store the BitLocker key in the TPM. I'm not going to require a PIN here. But if you're using things like MBAM, or if you wanted to delete this page completely, that would be totally fine as well. So that looks good for BitLocker. Under the volume, we're definitely going to do some customization here. So the first thing we want to look at is the images. So we can see we've got the Windows 7 image here. But what I'm going to do, I'm just going to click manually add an operating system image, and I'm just going to give it a friendly name here. So Windows 10 Enterprise x64. I'm going to do that for the display name. That looks good. For the actual image name, I think I'm actually going to make this more generic. Windows 10. I'm going to remove the spacing here because this is going to be a variable that we're going to use when we actually go and configure our task sequence for multiple images. So I'm going to just set this OSD image name equals, I'm going to just paste this in here so I can reference this when we come back. So that looks good. The display name is what's actually going to show to the user. So that looks good. That's better there. And then it's a 64-bit image. So that looks good. I'll copy this here. And then I'm going to delete that Windows 7 one because we're not going to use that for now. I'm going to manually add another one here. Paste in that. But for this one, we're going to do this for Windows 10 Education. So Windows 10 Education, I'm just going to delete the name here, just delete the spaces, make this 64-bit for the architecture, and then OK. I'm going to paste that in there as well, just so we've got that. Now, if you have images in your SCCM, you can actually choose to select an existing image that will browse out to your site. You might have to go to the Config Manager tab and tell your site, give it the site code in the server and choose Validate if you had never set this up before. Otherwise, it wouldn't load that. So if you wanted to, you could actually use that option, and then we could browse out and choose our Windows 7 Enterprise 64-bit. But if we look at this, sometimes the names can be kind of, doesn't look right. So for example, this one read the disk name. So that's why I usually just manually create it. But what we'll do, we'll change that variable for the image name to get rid of the spaces here. And then we'll copy that. Zoom out. Let me just paste in. Uh-oh. All right, so just copied those since I overwrote them. So this looks good. We've got 3 different image selections that we can do here. Under the user data, we're going to choose the option to pre-select the format drive. So this will just have the format option pre-selected by default. So this can be helpful so they wouldn't have to go and click that, since in most cases you do want to format the disk if you're doing a new machine. So that looks good. Under the select target, so this would be the USMT option if you wanted to make this available. Since we're doing this for a new computer, it's probably unlikely that we would need to use any type of user state. So what I'm going to do is right click that page and choose to remove the item. And that's just going to get that rid of that for our wizard. The deployment readiness option, so this will be if you want to have those checks in place. So optionally, you could add any type of custom scripts that you wanted here. In my case, I think we'll just leave everything default and keep that page in there. Okay, so the new computer details is one that we're going to change quite a few things. So there's going to be where they enter the computer name, the domain, the OU, and the domain join account. So what we're going to do here, I'm going to leave the computer name just empty by default, so they would have to type that in. If you wanted to pre-fill that, like you can use some different scripts that could run before this to maybe pre-fill it with things like the serial number, depending on your naming conventions. But I'm just going to leave it empty here and have that just where the user selects that. What I do want to do here is add the domain. So contoso.local. For the friendly name, we'll just call it Contoso. Once that domain's added, we're going to have the ability to right-click it and choose to search the domain for OUs. So this is where we can go and select what OUs we want to make available for our users. We can select multiple by holding the control. So I'm going to include the servers and the workstations OU here. If you want, you can optionally rearrange these. So I'm going to make the workstations show up here first. And then for the actual setting, let's see what we got here. Network details. What I'm going to do is make the domain name checked by default, and I'm also going to lock it. So they wouldn't have the ability to go and change it to the work group. For the domain join credentials, I really want to just set this to be my default account here, so that contoso /SCCM_DJ. So I'm just going to pre-fill in that account, and I'm going to lock that account here. I'm also going to lock the password value. We're actually not going to provide this. We're going to enter this account in on the back end of the task sequence. But what we need to do to make that work is we can't have it do the credential check because there's not going to be any credentials actually entered during the wizard. So we're going to disable the AD check for these two options down here. Otherwise, that the check wouldn't work because the password wouldn't be defined here. So that looks good. The admin password, like I mentioned, we're not going to give the end user or the IT tech the ability to change that or set that during the sequence. So I'm just going to delete that step completely. User device affinity, I'm not too worried about that in my scenario. Same thing with language. So we're just going to be working with the English language here. So I'm going to remove that page as well. The install program. So this can be one that can be quite helpful. So what we're going to do here, this is going to be the default option. It's just going to be a generic sample application that doesn't do anything. So we're going to remove that. I'm going to rename this from general software to base applications. Okay. So the base applications are going to be anything that we want to force to install and lock it so the user can't uncheck it. So one thing we have to do in order to install applications is under this configuration manager up in the ribbon, what we have to do, make sure you have your site integrated, and you actually have to create a collection for targeting applications too. So this is just going to be a dummy collection. In my case, it looks like it read it from my previous configuration. So I've got an application collection named MDT apps. So if we come and look at my collections, I've created one under the OSD folder called MDT apps. We can see currently we don't have anything deployed to that collection. So in order for the UDI Wizard to actually be able to get policy that it's going to create for dynamically installing applications, we need to target the application to that dummy collection in order for us to actually see the application in the wizard and select it for deployment. So if I were to click Add Software to Group and go out and choose the application and then choose to select an application and search here, you do want to make sure you don't have this option Show Windows App Packages Only. I think that's enabled by default. But what we can see here, even though I have applications showing up in my applications within SCCM, they're not showing up in the UDI Wizard because we have to target them to that collection. So for example, if we were to click that collection, choose Deploy Application, I'm going to deploy the local administrator password solution application first. So that's going to be one that I'm going to include as a base application that always installs. This is just so we can get the policy. So I'm just going to keep everything default here. This is never going to go to any computers. So one thing you can notice as well, just to make sure people didn't accidentally create any computers that were added, we can see that we're actually limiting this collection to the unknown computers, which would only contain 2 objects that represent unknown computers. So even if you accidentally tried to create a query, they wouldn't get these apps deployed because we're doing that limiting to only unknown computers. So now we have that application deployed. If we come back here and search, we can see that it's now showing up. So if I click OK on that and choose Finish, we can now see that this is under the base applications. So what I'm going to do is right-click the application here and choose to lock it. So that means that the user cannot unselect this at runtime. And then what we're going to do is create a new software group, and we'll call this accounting. So say you had a scenario where you wanted to make different applications available for different groupings of departments within your organization. So if we were to come in here and add software to group, we're going to add an application. And what we're going to do is come back to that collection. We're going to choose Deploy Application, and then we'll choose Java for this one. We'll do Next here, just all the defaults. We're just getting this so we have the policy that we can select the app. So if we go and search again, we can now see we have Java showing up. So that looks good. So we'll add that here. We'll also create another department here called Information Technology. We're going to create this as a root level. We're going to add software to group. I'm going to go ahead and deploy the 7-zip application. Target that to this collection. Next for all the defaults. And if we search now, Now, if you notice 7-zip is actually grayed out, because this is something that is easy to miss. If you didn't go into your application under the properties of it, and if you didn't enable the option to allow it to install in a task sequence, it's going to show as that grayed out option. So if we go and change that, and then come back to our wizard, search again, we can now see that it's available. So that's something that can be pretty easy to miss. Just wanted to make sure that I covered that as well. And we have one more app. Let's do Foxit Reader. So we have to deploy that first. So we'll go to Deploy, Application, Foxit Reader. We'll get that deployed. Now for packages, you don't have to do any type of pre-deployment to them. They should just show up if you were to add a package. So come back in here and do a search. Foxit Reader. It looks like I also did not have the option enabled for the task sequence to run from it. So if I come back in here and enable that, we do OK. And then if we do a search, we can see that it's now showing available. So this looks good. So if we go ahead and go back to my flow, looks like that was really the last page. So we had the summary here. I'll leave that page, but now we're going to go ahead and choose to save that XML file. We're going to overwrite the existing one. All right. So I've been having some weird permission issues. Let me just save that over to my desktop. So it's got those two files. Let me see if I can paste this over. All right. All right, let me see if I can copy that to the local path. I think I have something weird going on with my sharing permissions. There we go. So we got those files saved here successfully where that package is. So now what we want to do is go into our packages. So SCCM, when you created your MDT packages and settings package within the wizard for your task sequence, it's going to automatically create the package within SCCM. So what you want to do is right click and choose the update distribution point. That's going to make sure that we have the latest XML that we just updated and get that onto our content library. So then what we're going to do is go ahead and make sure we have these two packages distributed to our distribution point. So in our case, we just have a single one for this lab and we'll get that distributed. All right, so if we come back and run that preview again, let's see what we have going on. So we've got the welcome screen. We didn't change any of the text there. We can see that BitLocker is now unchecked by default. We've got our 3 different image options here. The deployment check, the new computer, we've got our OU available. We've got our application grouping, so if we wanted to select any additional apps and we're deploying it, that looks good. And then the summary page. So that looks good, I think, for what I want to test out here. But going back to our task sequence, we do have to do some customizations here to support what we did with multiple images. So if we come to our sequence and look at the first thing that I'm going to change here is the apply drivers. So like I mentioned in the previous video we did, usually I don't like using the auto apply drivers step because it just kind of searches out and you never really know what drivers it might try to apply based on the plug and play ID. So the apply driver package is usually what I like going with. So we're going to create a new group here. And we're going to call it apply drivers Windows 10 x64. All right. And then for the condition, if we remember our image names, so we're only going to have this folder run. We're going to use an if statement, and if any of the conditions match here. So under that if statement, we're going to add the task sequence variable. So on the back end, depending on what they select, it's going to set the OSD image name variable, and it's going to be based on that value that we copied from the UDI Wizard. So if it's Windows 10 Enterprise x64 or Windows 10 Education x64, we're going to go through this step for these drivers for Windows 10. So that looks good. We'll copy this step, paste it down. Just move that one step down here so it's on the same level. And we're just going to rename this to Windows 7 x64. And we're going to copy that Windows 7 OSD image name that we created. And we're going to go ahead and change this variable. We're going to delete one, remove that one, and then we're going to change the existing one to the Windows 7 variable. So we can see that these two apply driver steps are going to be condition based on the image name is going to determine whether they run. So if we come here, I think I do have one driver package for the Surface Book. So let me just copy that step. And I should be able to just paste that directly into the Windows 10 folder. So that condition should automatically have had the Surface Book that we had for searching for the model. So we can see this looks pretty good. So we're only going to run the Windows 10 folder if the image name is a Windows 10 image name that we had. And then it's still going to have condition based for each model for the driver packages that you might have within there. Now, one thing I want to note, if you're using a custom Mac key, you would also have to have two different apply Windows setting steps. So let me just copy that to show you what that would look like in case you were using a Mac key instead of like KMS, because you would have different Mac keys. Let me also shorten these names. I think that looks better when we can see it all. Win7 x64. All right. So we had those apply Windows settings. We're going to paste in the same settings here. And then we're going to make this one Win7 x64. And what we're going to do, we're going to add the same conditions that we had for the image names here. So I'm just going to pause the video while I add that. All right, so I added those conditions so we can see the Windows 10 option for the settings, and then we have the condition for Windows 7. Now, like I mentioned, this would really only be needed if you're using a Mac key here instead of KMS, but just want to show you how in case you were using that. So that looks good. So now what we're going to do is go down to our apply image step. So apply operating system image. So as you can expect, we also need to condition base the apply image step based on what image is selected. So if you remember, we had the enterprise one by default. So that's going to be what's here by default. So we want to add a condition, task sequence variable, OSD image name. So if it equals the Windows 10 Enterprise, if they select that option, we're going to have that apply that OS. So I'm going to just rename this step to apply OS dash Win10 x64 Enterprise. We'll go ahead and copy that step, paste that here. And then what we're going to do, we're going to copy the education one. So we do have a education here. So if you remember, we had that install.wim, the default one from the ISO, and that one contained multiple different indexes. So that looks good. So education is the first index, so we shouldn't need to change anything. And we're going to only run this step if you had the education edition variable. Now, one thing to note here, if we come back and look at the designer for our image selection, if we choose that option, select an operating system image, if you look at the Windows 10, the install.wim, you can see that's going to load all these different indexes. So for example, the education, enterprise. So if you wanted to have multiple indexes, the pro index, for example, you can see that the index here is going to change. So if we were to select that option and add that to the wizard, you can see it's automatically going to change the OSD image index to number 5. So if you wanted to have, if you were using the install.wim and had multiple indexes or editions essentially of Windows 10, you could come in here and add the index variable or just select the index from the image. So that would select, based on this dropdown, it would dynamically select the index that you assign to the image that you add in the UDI Wizard. So that's an easy way you could use the default install.wim, and you can make all these options available by adding these different steps based on the conditions that we're running. So I'm going to copy this one, paste in that, and we're just going to rename this one for Windows 7. So Windows 7 Enterprise. We're going to browse out. I'm going to select my Windows 7 image, and then we're going to copy our variable name and overwrite that existing one. So we can see here that we've got 3 different apply OSs. I'm going to just do a new grouping, apply OS, and add these all up here just to make it a little bit more organized. Okay. All right, that looks good. So determining what the user selects in the UDI designer when this displays, it's going to determine which apply OS index or image runs based on that variable that we're selecting here. Right, you can see we've got a few different things running, like software updates, for example. In my case, I don't have any software updates deployed to the unknown computers. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to just disable this so the task sequence runs a little bit faster because we don't have to evaluate updates. Here you can see we're installing any packages. So based on whether you added packages to that application, they're going to all go into a variable name, and then it's going to dynamically install them. We can also see the applications here. It's going to dynamically install applications. So any application that's selected in the wizard, it's going to put it into this variable and then dynamically install all of those within this step of the task sequence. But I think that's pretty good. I think that covers most of the main things that are actually going to run here based on the conditions that we added. I don't think I have anything else that we really need to cover here. Let me just make sure we apply all these changes. And then I'm going to deploy this task sequence to the unknown computers collection. So I'm going to just be using an unknown device to pixie boot up here. So we're going to target the unknown computers. Looks good. We're going to make the task sequence only available in media and pixie. So it could only be pixie booted to deploy this or a USB drive created. I'll leave all the defaults here. None of these should really apply for a pixie boot. Distribution point, we're allow fallback in the scenario that we didn't have the package there. I don't think that should apply in our scenario. And then we'll deploy that. Then close. Okay. If we look at the references tab of our task sequence, we can see it looks like all of our packages are distributed to our distribution points, and they're all compliant. So that looks good. We shouldn't have any failures because our content's not there. So if we come over to one of our machines, let's see if we can get this guy pixie booted and see what we get here. All right, so that looks good. So we can see we have our task sequence showing up here, deploy Windows client. Okay, let me just open CM Trace, and what we'll do in the background is go to our temp folder, SMSTS log, and then we'll go ahead and open the task sequence log so we can see what's going on when we start running this. It looks like I do have the OSD computer name variable still on the unknown computers collection. That's why we're getting prompted for this. Usually this wouldn't happen unless in the SCCM console under the unknown computers collection, So this is from the previous video where we were just using the computer name variable directly on the collection, just the most simple way we can give it a computer name. So we don't need that anymore because we're going to define the computer name directly in the UDI Wizard. So I'll just leave this empty and choose Next. So the first thing that we can see that's going to happen is going to go download the Toolkit package. So all the script files and the things that need to run for us to use MDT, that's what's going to download here first. All right, so we can see that it is now showing us the designer. So if we actually look at what's happening on the bottom here, we can just see that it's running the command that's calling that XML file. So that's going to be what's showing us this wizard here. So this is the welcome screen that we added. So we just have next here. We can see that BitLocker is unchecked by default, but we didn't lock that. So a user could optionally come in here and enable that option if they wanted to. In our case, this is just a VM. I don't have TPM set up on it. So that obviously would not be something we want to enable. Here we can see we have the different images. So we have our Enterprise, our Windows 10 Education, and then Windows 7 Enterprise. For this test, let's go ahead and just do Education since that's not the default option and just make sure that all works okay. We can see that we have it set to partition the disk by default because we enabled that option. So that looks good. We've got the different checks that are going on here. So checking things like power. The application one, that usually shows warnings based on what I've seen in the past. That should be fine though. A new computer name. So we're just going to call this OSD Demo UDI. If we have the domain, you can see we only had the single domain, but you could add multiple here if you did have multiple domains. And then you can see we have our different OUs. So we've got the workstations by default, and that's where we want this machine to go. So we'll choose next here. We've got the base applications here. So that's that application is going to be locked. And let's just say we want to go and do the information technology. So act like this was an IT computer, and then it's going to install those two sub applications that we've added. The final summary screen, we do finish. And this is going to go through the process of formatting the disk. So if we look back on our task sequence, it's going to basically dynamically go through this based on the variables that were selected based on your wizard. So in our case, this is the new computer group. So this is where we showed the UDI wizard. And this is the actual step that we're running to format the disk. So that's kind of what's going on here. Now it's going to use the Toolkit package once more. And then it should go through and kind of download the image. So we'll pause while we wait for that. All right, so we can see that it downloaded the WIM file. It looks like I did not rename the step. So it says it's actually applying Windows 10 Enterprise. But that is actually, if we come back and look at my task sequence here, you see how we kept this step, both of these Enterprise. But if we look at the actual variable, it is education that I added here. And the actual image that's being applied here is the education image. So what I could do is simply rename this, but I'll wait for this task sequence to actually complete just so we don't have any policy conflicts. But this should be applying the education edition, and we'll verify that once the imaging is done. We could actually verify that now. So the package, it looks like, is ends in 72. So if we actually come back here and look at our images, we can see that it is in fact using the 72, which is that default install.wim. And we can verify that the image index for education is image index 1. So that looks good. I just forgot to rename that. All right, so looks like at this point, We are now about to install the software, so let me see if I can copy CM Trace over here. All right, so at this point we just restarted and we performed the UBI or out of the box experience. And now it's at the point where it's actually installing the config manager client. So if we go to C Windows, CCM setup, logs, and then look at our CCM setup log, what we should see is at this point it's going to be installing the client. So it looks like that just completed. So we'll wait for it to go on to the application step. So if we look at the app enforced log in the CCM logs folder, we can actually see the MSIs being installed here. So this will show us information like the command line that's running. This should be pretty quick. We only had the 3 applications here. All right, that looks good. All right, so the last thing that's going to show up here is the deployment complete wizard. Now, this will show us information about how long it took, the status about different applications that were installed, and then we can go ahead and click Start Windows. Now, if you didn't want to have this last pane show up, what you can do in your task sequence is there's a task that's called Report Done. If you want to disable this step, that will also disable that last step wizard. So instead of having to click Start at the end, it would take us right here to the login screen. All right, so we are all logged in. We do a quick look here. We can see that we've got Windows 10 Education, so it looks like our image applied successfully. Take a look at our apps. We can see that we've got our 3 different apps that we installed here. So that looks good. Looks like we did everything. We did some customization using UDI. That should be all I think I wanted to cover in this video. Hopefully this was helpful for you, and thank you for watching.